One day when I was a high school special educator, a student of mine directed an expletive at me and just bolted out of the classroom. And to be honest, I'd kind of grown a bit used to things like that from this particular student. I kept my cool and I kept teaching, only to be interrupted maybe 20 or so minutes later by the school social worker, who found the student roaming the hallway, and she asked if I could have a word outside with her and the student in the hallway. She wanted to convince me to allow him back into the classroom with no consequences, rather than write the student up for insubordination and, as was my policy, change his attendance that day to an absence. The reason for the request, she told me, is that the student was having a particularly rough time over the past week, having experienced some life event that I can't any longer recall, over top of being the primary caregiver of siblings while his single mother worked. Could I, she asked, look past this outburst this one time? I think this is a prime example of the clash between the values of equity and equality. Two options were open before me. I could treat the student equally to his peers, assigning him the same consequence I'd assign any other student who did what he did, or I could treat him equitably by taking account of the arguably unique circumstances and treating him arguably in accord with his unique needs. Roughly, the difference between equity and equality is a difference in how we define fairness. Equality relies on the notion of fairness as sameness of treatment, while equity relies on a notion of fairness as a treatment that best fits one's situation. This struggle between equity and equality is also a good example of what legal scholar Martha Minow calls a dilemma of difference. She describes such difference as confronting the following question. When does treating people differently emphasize their differences and stigmatize or hinder them on that basis? And when does treating people the same become insensitive to their differences and likely to stigmatize or hinder them on that basis? See, equality quite literally means ignoring at least certain difference that we could but choose not to take into account. When we talk about equality before the law, we mean equal treatment regardless of differences like race, class, sex, religion, etc. Equity, on the other hand, means allowing certain differences that we could ignore to factor into outcomes, like allowing someone's diagnosed disability to determine how much longer they have for an assignment than their non-disabled peers. Equality means ignoring certain differences, same treatment despite differences, where equity means allowing certain differences to affect treatment. Very different ways of proceeding. The point of this video is not going to be to resolve the question of which notion is superior, but to flesh out what can be said for and against each of these concepts. My own position is that it's fruitless to ask whether equity or equality is the superior course, except on a case-by-case basis, where we look at where we're trying to go, as well as the demands our travel is trying to meet. So that's what we'll do in this video, talk about the differences between equity and equality. By now, we've all likely seen the following chart that's meant to illustrate the difference between equality and equity. On the left, equality is depicted as folks of different heights having to view a baseball game over the same size wall standing on the same sized platforms, which inevitably means that the shorter person will have a tougher and the taller person an easier time of it. On the right, equity is depicted as adjusting the size of the platforms people stand on relative to the different heights of the person, hence allowing people of different sizes to see over the same wall. So this chart is a really effective, because simple, way to explain the differences between these two ideas. But the chart depicts a single situation where equity appears to be the clear winner. In this case, the goal of the subjects is to see over a wall, and it just so happens that there's as many standing platforms as will help each person see over the wall if we just apportion them equitably. Equity is a great course in situations where the goal is to generate outcomes that work for very different people who vary in precisely the ways that treating people equally would not work for. If the goal is for people of drastically different heights to see the same game over the same wall, equity is the clear winner. But that's one of many possible situations with one of many possible goals. One place where equality seems to be preferable to equity is on the road. We all follow the same traffic laws. We don't hold some people to the speed limit, allowing others to break it because they have places they really need to be or are more important than other people. We expect that everyone will have working headlights and don't allow financial hardship to be an excuse to break that rule. Even bicyclists follow almost exactly the same rules as huge gas-guzzling cars. What are some of the differences between these situations that affect whether they're governed by equity or equality? Well, first, in the latter but not the former situation, the only way the enterprise of the road maintains order is if everyone is subject to the same rules. The only way I can predict what other cars will do is to know we're all subject to the same rules. On the other hand, there's no good reason why friends of different heights trying to peer over the same fence need to have equality as a social glue. Another difference between these two situations is scale, or relative size of the situation or enterprise. In the picture of friends looking over the wall, there are only 3 people, and moreover, they appear to viewers of the picture as a family or maybe close friends. In the small-scale situation where everyone appears to know and care for others, equity does seem to be the right course. But if those 3 presumed family members were in a presumably large stadium, equitably, even if it were still a worthy goal, might be a harder to achieve one because it requires targeted attention to individual needs that a large organization like a stadium maybe can't attend to. Large organizations could achieve equity by having different sets of rules for different groups with different needs, like how different income brackets follow different tax rules. But this can get messy, and different rules for different groups can take away from the felt cohesiveness of the organization. So, despite its drawbacks, sometimes equality is just easier to scale. A final difference might be that in different circumstances, differences in people might carry more or less salience towards the goal in question. For example, students vary in all sorts of ways: attention span, interests, strengths, weaknesses, just to name some. But in most cases, this just means that different students can still be bound to the same rules and expectations, even if they must work in different ways in order to meet them. But in other situations, differences can be so drastic or pertinent that holding students to the same set of rules would seem grossly unfair, as when students with very severe learning differences are expected to do the same work in the same environments in the same amount of time as their peers. Things get even more complicated when we get back to my classroom situation, where the school social worker is asking me to treat this particular student equitably rather than equally. Here, the dilemma is harder because both of these values, equity and equality, make plausible demands on the teacher and the classroom. Equality, we might say, is an imperative in classrooms to keep a certain type of order. Here are the rules. They apply the same to all, and if you break the rules, you and I both know what results from that. Aspiring to treat students equitably might mean throwing the certainty of these rules into doubt, and that could mean other students will see what they can get away with. Equality also satisfies a certain notion of fairness. If I were to apply my classroom rules unequally in front of all the other students where everyone can see differences in treatment, it would open up all manners of complaints that what I did wasn't fair. And honestly, they'd have a point. On the other hand, there's another sense of fairness better satisfied by equity. Since students really are quite different, both in their persons and their circumstances, treating all the same often means imposing a harder burden on some than on others, mandating that the shorter person strain harder to see over the same wall as her taller peer. As a former special educator, this equity was the very rationale for giving some students accommodations not available to all, like extra time on assignments for those who had reading or attention difficulties, or allowing tests to be taken orally for students who had difficulty with reading and writing. Another advantage of equity in classrooms is that if the goal is for students to learn the material, then as long as students differ in ways relevant to that goal, equity might be the best path for achieving that goal for everyone. When students, for instance, would complain that other students with documented disabilities were treated differently from the general student population, one of my responses was, well, why do you care? This isn't a competition where you and they are competing for the same prize. The goal is that all of you learn the material, and they might need different treatment than you in order for all of us to achieve that goal. Actually, this was the response that students seemed to find the most convincing. We can see the difference between these two types of fairness, equity, and equality with a final example, a sports competition. When we play sports, we tend to opt for equality, where everyone, regardless of difference, plays by the same rules. In some sense, it's the very heart of what it means to play a sport. Same rules and a competition to see who can function best within those rules. But let's say that we're playing an informal game of some sport with people of widely varying ages and abilities, and the goal is less to compete than to allow everyone to have fun and maybe some people to learn the game. Here, it might be that fairness of equity is the best course, like when my 5-year-old plays baseball with kids slightly older and younger than himself. Those who can will hit the ball from the pitcher, and those who can't get to hit the ball off the tee. Those who can get 3 turns at bat, and those who can't get 4. Whether equity or equality is the best notion of fairness will often depend on the situation and the goal. So there I was in class, having to figure out whether to treat this particular student equitably or equally, keep the type of order where everyone's treated the same way and difference is ignored, or have grace for a student whose challenges are arguably heavier than any faced by other students that day. I didn't realize it then, but the reason my decision was so difficult was precisely that each way I go had something to be said for it, but also came at some cost. Both values, equity and equality, are potentially important components of social life and organization, and in the case of my classroom, both demands are alive. Equality may be necessary to provide certain types of order and justice. Equity may be necessary in order to get very different students to learn to the same standard or get them to do the same things. Probably needless to say, but I'm not going to end this video by telling you what decision I made that day. Either way, it was a potentially good decision that also came with potential dangers. Anyhow, the important thing isn't what I did, it's what you'll do.